Hey, so in today's video, we're going to talk about two things. One, where the comics world is at today, and two, where it might be going. Now, these things are not super researched and they're a little bit subjective, so take them with a grain of salt. But here's what's going on the way I see it. So there's of course so much I could say to cover the space between, say, 1985 and now. It's literally 30 years worth of time. But to just point to a couple of big moments, one is the superhero renaissance. We get British invasion starting in the mid-1980s, where writers like, most famously, Alan Moore, but also Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman come over into the States and begin writing for some of the big superhero titles. They bring a darker, grittier, more serious approach to the superhero books. For a while, regenerate superhero readership. It only lasts so long. The 90s are kind of a dark time for superheroes. It's an era of Rob Liefeld and a million X-Men reboots. But another kind of superhero renaissance seems to occur in the 2000s. A lot of really great writers, maybe not as big names as Alan Moore or Neil Gaiman, but a lot of really interesting and good writers decide to come back to DC and Marvel and write some really interesting superhero books. Interest in superheroes is, of course, in no small part renewed by the movies that began to happen around early 2000s with the Spider-Man movie, but of course by mid-2000s with the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And certainly many of the movies are based on popular and well-loved storylines, sometimes classic ones from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and sometimes more recent ones. We can't say for sure exactly how much influence back and forth has gone from the big movie hits back and forth to the comics. So the superhero has never entirely gone away and continues to this day to rise and flow in popularity. Another big thing that's happened is the rise of creator-owned publishers. This particularly happened in the early 1990s, and these are slightly different than what I was talking about with the alternative publishers. Image, IDW, Dark Horse, some of them also publish licensed material, but one of the main things that they do is publish the works of creators who own their characters. So unlike Marvel and DC, where the artists and the writers are working exclusively with material that is owned by the corporation, these publishers get to publish the work of artists who want to work in more popular culture, genre-centered work. They still get to own the characters, they still get to own the intellectual copyright for. Image started out kind of as a offshoot of Marvel. It was actually founded by Rob Liefeld, who I mentioned, and several others, with characters who looked very much like kind of knockoff X-Men at the time. But it has shifted and changed now, and creates books like Bitch Planet, Saga, and Monstrous, which we'll be reading for this week. Another thing that certainly affects this week's reading in Monstrous is the increasing amount of global and cross-cultural influence in comics, and particularly, in the case of American comics, the increasing influence of manga. A lot of publishing decisions made in the early 2000s changed the way that most Americans read and consumed manga, for the better, and made it much more accessible to most folks. Where it was once a very kind of obscure, super nerdy fan thing, it became much more mainstream around 2002. And with that mainstreaming, it also began to affect and influence the visual and even storytelling style of a lot of artists. And this influence has been felt sometimes in very extreme levels and sometimes very subtly. We see it across many genres, not just in sort of action-adventure, but we'll also even see superhero books sometimes that look, quote-unquote, like manga. And then we'll also get books like Monstrous, in this case, in which Sana Takeda, who's actually a Japanese artist, is now working for an American company. Of course, technology has changed everything. One of the biggest areas in which technology has begun to change comics is digital versus traditional media. Interestingly, there are a lot of artists who still really prefer traditional media in comics, who still prefer to use paper and ink. Coloring has gone almost completely digital, but as I mentioned, there are still many artists who use traditional media for penciling. Inking is probably, it seems, about half and half. When it comes to e-readers and digital publishing, well, that's changing as well. The industry is very slow to accept it for multiple reasons. Some things like, well, double-page spreads are really hard to do in e-readers and digital publishing, as most readers have a single page flip. So you would have to flip the device and or make the double page spread very small in order to see double page spread. Early e-readers had difficulties deciding whether to move panel by panel or use the whole page, for example. So there was a lot of kinks worked out when figuring out how to do comics digitally. And it seems people are still experimenting. However, sites like Comixology have been gaining a whole lot of ground in the digital publishing industry, and in fact have been helping with translation. So there's a Russian comics publishing company called Bubble, which has not been able to publish many of its comics in English in print, but has been able to publish them digitally and save a lot of money that way. Of course, this brings to mind webcomics. Since the internet has been born, there have been webcomics, and these have ranged from your gag strips to comics that sort of mimic full-page comics to webcomics that take advantage of the native digital format using integrated animation and sound and scrolling in really fascinating ways. Some artists get their start in webcomics and then make the jump to more traditional comics. Other artists work in traditional comics, make a webcomic on the side, and go back. So it's been really fascinating to watch as webcomics grow. Of course, webcomics brings to mind the internet, and the internet has changed comics in multiple interesting ways. Not just specifically the comics form, but the way that we interact with comics. One of the ways that this has changed things most notably is the way in which fandom acts and interacts with each other and with the industry and its creators. So comics has always had fans. It's always been a popular art. Part of being a popular art is that you have fans and fans make communities. So the internet has changed the way that these fan communities interact with each other. And one of the things that it's done has increased the visibility of certain communities. For a very long time, certain kinds of communities were only visible to each other. So you would only know that the people who liked your books were the people who were in your comic shop, or the people that you talked to. But now it's much easier to know and get to know people around the world who like not just comics, not just a character, but maybe a very specific character or a very specific storyline or two very specific characters. And you not only know the 5 people in your town that like comics, but you get to create a very specific community of people who like the very specific things that you do. And so that increases the visibility of your community for you. It also increases the visibility of certain communities outside. So, for example, people are suddenly surprised that women like comics. Women have always liked comics. A lot of women just didn't hang out in many of the spaces that were dominated by men, but the internet has created a space for women comics fans to have a space and make their voices heard. And so suddenly they are much more visible. The internet has also increased connection between fans and artists. You could always write letters, you could always maybe meet people at fan conventions, but with the speed and accessibility of social media, fans and artists are now interfacing more than ever before, and not just artists, but also companies. So when fans don't like a storyline or don't like a depiction, artists hear about it. When they do like a depiction or do like a storyline, artists and companies hear about it. So one can think about the ways in which stories and depictions might shift or change because artists now know that they are directly accountable not just to editors, publishers, and, say, publishing numbers, but also they might have to answer to their fans on Twitter. And of course, due to things like Kickstarters, Patreons, and all sorts of formats of webcomics and blogs, the internet has changed the way that people can self-publish and the amounts of audiences that they can reach. In the past, self-publishing meant maybe printing out 100 copies of a zine, but now you can self-publish a novel or a graphic novel and possibly reach way more people. So if you want to self-publish a comic, you can not only self-publish it online, but you might actually be able to self-publish a book that you can then bring to cons at a much higher production value than you ever were capable of in the past, and with much higher community support than you ever had in the past, because of the way that internet communities have changed and disrupted traditional publishing practices. That's it for the videos anyway. If you have any more questions or concerns, you can contact me. All of my information is on the contact page. and I hope to see you around campus at some point. Take care.